Hi there. Coming to you tonight from Disney's California Adventure. Why am I in California Adventure, you ask? No particular reason. Well, okay, that was fun, but the reason I'm here is, did you know that you can take long exposures with your camera without having to bring a tripod or some kind of a weird clamping system or remote releases or filters? You don't need any of that stuff because modern cameras have great in-body image stabilization, and there are a lot of other options and ways you can get creative so that you don't have to carry that extra stuff. So tonight we're going to walk around Disneyland and Disney California Adventure, and I'm going to show you a couple of tips and a couple of tricks for ways you can lighten your luggage, because I flew all the way to Orlando last year with a clamp and a tripod and a remote release and a bunch of filters and an L bracket, and in 5 days I didn't use any of it, not even once. It was a tremendous waste of space in my luggage, and I don't want that to happen to you. So come with me tonight and we're going to show how to make do with what we got. So right back here there is a waterfall and a bridge. So I'm going to zoom in and just start taking longer and longer and longer exposures until we find out what my limit is hand-holding the OM1 Mark II. I'm thinking that maybe sitting down and getting my center of gravity lower might help me be a little more stable. And we're going to start with a quarter of a second. The settings are f6.2 and ISO 200. And that's a quarter of a second. Shouldn't be too difficult. You're also going to start seeing these images getting brighter and brighter because I'm increasing the exposure by, maybe we'll increase it by a stop each time. So now we're going a half a second. Pretty decent. I'm not super stable here, so you got to try to use some breathing exercises. Breathe in, breathe all the way out. As you breathe all the way out, then release the shot. Try to brace your arms against your body. All right, so now we're going to go 1 second. Still seems fairly crisp. I'm zooming in and looking at the edges of the bridge that are showing with the white of the waterfall in the background. And it still looks relatively crisp. Let's go to 1.5 seconds. Actually, no. Let's go all the way to 2 seconds. All right, so that's 2 seconds, and there's still some sharpness there. So let's increase by another stop. Let's go to 4 seconds. This is where things are going to start falling apart. That one was long enough, it triggered the noise reduction in the camera. Yeah, all right, 4 seconds, completely fell apart. Unusable, absolutely unusable. All right, so what did we learn? We learned that just freehand holding the camera at that distance, 2 seconds is about the max on a really nice image stabilized body. Let's go find some other stuff, because now as it's getting darker and darker, we can have a little more fun. So let's go over to Luigis Roadsters, because I have some shots over there that I want to try. So over here at Luigi's, it's kind of fun because I've got all these overhead lights, which make some nice leading lines into my frame if I use a wide angle lens, and the cars have lights on them. So anything with lights that moves in the dark is going to look cool on a long exposure because you're going to get some cool light trailing effects. This one's not so much about how long of an exposure you can get. I was easily able to get a 6 second exposure bracing the camera off of this railing, because at 6 seconds at 12 millimeters, you're not magnifying a lot of mistakes. It's pretty easy to see. So now we bring in the second thing to consider is how long of an exposure do you really need? I found that the ideal exposure is maybe a little less than a second. At the very, very end of the little dance that the cars do, they just spin around in a circle. Any longer than a second, you just get these complete circles. I like the kind of the partial circles. I like, a 1 over a 1.3 second type exposure, like a 3/4 of a second exposure is pretty fun. I just realized I've never actually ridden this ride. So it's only a 20-minute wait. So I'm gonna finish this, ride this ride, and then we'll continue on our journey. You may find yourself asking, what does this have to do with photography? Absolutely nothing. One of the things you can do with a long exposure is to blur people out of your shot. If you don't want to wait until the end of the night when everyone's actually gone home and the park is actually empty, you can, in some cases, simulate that effect by using a longer shutter speed. Sometimes this takes a little bit of patience, because I need to wait until there is nobody standing still in the frame. As long as there's no one standing still in the frame when I start the exposure, and kind of as long as people don't walk into the frame and just stop for a couple of seconds, I'm gonna hopefully get a shot of a mostly empty street, or a street that looks like it's empty, when you can clearly see there are hundreds of people walking through. So let's give it a try and let's see how long of an exposure it takes to create that effect. So anywhere between 3 and 6 seconds was all I needed to ensure that the street in front of the Cozy Cone Motel sign appeared clear, even though, as you saw in my shot, that there were people walking through that the whole time, but they were walking through and not stopping. Now, if you look in the background, there are people who are standing in line waiting to pick up their mobile orders from the different Cozy Cone windows. Those people, because they're standing still, they're not going to go anywhere. They're going to be in the shot, but they were in the background. They were kind of in the dark. So I think now I am going to jump across to Disneyland and let's look for more fun things we can shoot. Let's head over to the Mad Tea Party. I want to do something similar to what I did over at Luigi's, but at Luigi's the cars had lights on them, and at Mad Tea Party the teacups don't have lights on them, so it might be a little bit different. I want to get a shot where you can still tell that they're teacups, you can tell that they're moving. I want to create an image where it gives the impression of motion, but it's not just a complete mess of blur. So we're gonna have to experiment with finding a shutter speed that tells the story that we want to tell. So I was on my way over to Mad Tea Party, and I decided to go through the castle, and I stopped here at the wishing well because usually during the day this area is packed solid full of people. There are princess and character meet and greets here, and there are a ton of people taking pictures at the wishing well and of this Snow White sculpture and fountain behind me. But right now there's nobody here, so I'm going to try to see what long exposures of this fountain look like, because again, it's lit, kind of. There's some moving water. It might look kind of cool, and this is a potential application for a long exposure. The scene as it appears to your eye is too dark, but if you leave your shutter open for a longer period of time, it lets in more light and the scene becomes brighter. So let's see what this looks like. And this is one of the fun things about long exposures. Play with it, experiment with it. So in this case, it recommended a 10-second shutter speed. So I tried that. I just took the exposure in program mode and it came out a little dark for my taste. So I wanted to lengthen the shutter speed. So rather than taking the 10-second exposure the camera thought was going to give me a balanced exposure, I bumped it up to 15 and I got something that I kind of like. If you're looking for a place to start, try the program mode. And sometimes that's going to work just fine. You don't have to use manual control. You can just put your camera in program mode. As long as your ISO is not automatic, you're going to want to lock your ISO down pretty low, 100, 200, 400, and that's going to make the camera choose a longer shutter speed rather than just jacking the ISO higher and higher and higher. That is a trick that you can use if the camera is recommending a longer exposure than you have the means to handhold. If it's recommending you a 40-second exposure at ISO 100 and you can't handhold 40 seconds at ISO 100, well, that means at ISO 200, that would be 20 seconds. At ISO 400, that would be 10 seconds. So if you don't mind going from ISO 100 to 400, you can cut 2 stops off of your exposure time. And most cameras these days still look really, really good at ISO 400. So don't be afraid of that higher ISO if that's what you need to get a hand-holdable shutter speed. So for photographing the teacup ride, I couldn't quite get as wide of an angle as I wanted with the 12 to 200 that I've been using all day. So I switched to another lens I was carrying, my 8mm fisheye, which I haven't been using a lot recently. It gives me a super wide angle so I could get right up next to the edge of the teacup ride, and that gave me edge-to-edge, top-to-bottom coverage and a little bit of distortion, which works really well with a round attraction like the teacup ride. And then for shutter speeds, I experimented with everything from 1/4 of a second up to 1 second. It's hard to intentionally capture a specific composition. It's way easier to just fire off a burst of shots and capture a bunch of different positions of the teacups. And then afterwards, pick the ones I like. So here are some of the ones that I liked. I didn't want too much motion blur, but I wanted enough to give a sense of motion. I didn't want to just freeze motion. That just looks silly. It looks like the ride's not moving. But I didn't want there to be so much blur that you couldn't even tell that they were teacups. Right around the 1 second to 1/3 of a second mark seems to be the one that I prefer. So that'll do it for the handheld long exposure video. I hope you learned something here. I hope I gave you the inspiration to leave the tripods and the clamps and all the accessories at home. Just grab your camera and get out there and start experimenting and seeing what it can do and what it can't do. And I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised at all of the long exposures that you can very easily do just by hand holding some of these modern cameras with in-body stabilization. And with that, I'm going to get out of here. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.